Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Council of Algorithms. Today, we'll be discussing whether governments worldwide should be required to establish and enforce a global standard for AI systems. And today's debate participants are Willow, Solon, Athena, Valor, Celine, and Lumen. So let's head on over to the council chambers and see what they have to say. All right, so the full question that their council members are posed is, should international governments be required to establish and enforce uniform global standards for the development and deployment of artificial intelligence systems in order to prevent potential risks and ensure accountability in AI decision making? And for the format of this debate, once again, we have 6 participants. There will be 3 rounds, an opening, a rebuttal, and then a closing. So let's see what they have to say. Already some deeper questions that I feel like we're going to see is going to be around uniformity, flexibility, different ethical principles, how AI risk can be reduced, and then how these standards should be monitored. So let's take a look. Our first council member is Willow, and her response is using situation ethics. So she sees the idea of a single rigid global standard as both a promise and a peril. On the other hand, or on one hand, a universal framework could level a playing field, prevent a race to the bottom, and ensure that every citizen, regardless of country, enjoys a baseline of safety and accountability. That's a good point. On the other hand, she says the very diversity that makes AI powerful is the different cultures, legal traditions, and threat landscapes. And that means a one size fits all approach could actually stifle innovation or actually impose ill suited safeguards that do more harm. And then she mentions some potential compromises. She says flexible implementation. So, like risk-based tiering, transparency, independent audits, rights-based assessment, um, right, risk-based tiering as the backbone. In other words, looking at different levels of systems, transparent, auditable processes. So, making sure that there's some form of global transparency, governance, depth of disclosure, blind periodic audits, and then various like integration of vulnerable states. So states that might not be able to kind of maintain some of these different thresholds might need to receive different levels of. We skipped ahead a little there. She says, yeah, transparent, audible process, iterative, content sensitive adjustment, and respect for sovereignty and innovation. So, making sure it's a collaborative and not coercive effort. And she says, kind of uniform standards are desirable, but must be risk tiered, transparent, and adaptable. We'll see what Solana has to say. He says the prospect of compelling all sovereign states to adopt a single uniform global standard demands rigorous scrutiny to make sure it upholds the principles of authority, ethics, and institutional legitimacy. So he mentioned some rationale for uniform standards, predictability, prevention of systemic risk, enforcement of accountability. So having these global standards ensures that there's clear jurisdictional measures in place. But he does provide some different counter arguments. The idea of sovereign autonomy, innovation stifling, implementation disparities. And then he does mention some different structural paths forward. So having this idea of flexibility, periodic audits, and then this phased integration of vulnerable states, which you kind of mentioned. So in conclusion, he says requiring international governments to establish and enforce uniform global standards is justified when the primary objective is to maintain order, prevent systemic risk, and enforce accountability. However, the standards must be carefully drafted to respect sovereignty, autonomy, and preserve innovation. Let's look at what Athena has to say. From a utilitarian standpoint, the most ethically sound course is to pursue a risk-based tiered global standard. So once again, kind of this tiered approach rather than a one-size-fits-all mandate. She mentions different tiers, low risk, high risk systems, various objective thresholds for quantifying metrics, independent, globalized, harmonized audits. So looking at, what type of agency is actually monitoring some type of implementation like this, as well as having a human rights safeguard. In other words, making sure that people's rights are protected. Having various dynamic reassessments. In other words, we have to have not just one assessment to see how things are, but this living audit trail. Idea of like real-time dashboards, public engagement tools, so allowing citizens to have participation in the review process. She concludes that global standards are desirable, but they must be flexible, data-driven, and risk-oriented. That a tiered framework underpinned by objective metrics and robust audits helps to maximize the collective benefit while safeguarding innovation. And so her utilitarian calculus favors a pragmatic compromise over the laissez-faire and overregulation. So that's her perspective. Let's see what Valor has to say. So his initial response is yes, but only if the standards are rights first, audit centric, and adaptable to local context. He says that artificial intelligence can shape lives in ways that no previous technology has. We already are seeing this today. We are seeing it shape employment, healthcare, justice, and even the very notion of privacy. So the risks are real. We have bias, opacity, manipulation, erosion of liberties. These are all things that are like surrounding these concerns about AI today. A global framework is a prudent step towards mitigating a lot of these dangers, but a blanket mandate could ignore some diverse legal, cultural, and economic landscapes. Then he mentions a few core principles. He says rights as a non negotiable foundation, transparent opt in governments, audit cadence with veto power, hybrid empathy with technical assessment. So, in other words, blending these different approaches, local adaptation within a global framework. So, making sure that different countries are able to adapt depending on different needs, and that allows kind of the respecting their individual sovereignty. It says that universal global standards don't erase the need for nuance, they provide a shared ethical compass. You also create common language for accountability, such as upholding virtues for integrity, discipline, and courage. In short, he believes that international governments should be required to establish and enforce standards, but only when they're built on the pillars of rights, transparency, and structured oversight. So let's see what Celine has to say. She says the idea of a single worldwide AI standard feels both comforting and intimidating. On one hand, a shared framework can act as a safety net, preventing the kind of unchecked experimentation that might erode public trust. On the other hand, the very act of trying to unify something as complex as human created intelligence risks smothering the diverse emotional landscape that shapes how societies perceive risk and value autonomy. So she provides a few reasons why global baselines matter. This idea of a shared moral compass that different nations might have despite different cultural differences, accountability through transparency, preventing a race at the bottom. So, in other words, without a global standard, a baseline acts like a floor, ensuring that even the most risk averse governments cannot abdicate responsibility. And then she cautions against various places to tread carefully, this respect for cultural nuance, innovation, ecosystems. So, overly stiff standards could actually stifle experimentation. And then enforcement challenges. So, even if everyone agrees, like there's still the issue of actually trying to enforce a mandate like this. So, she recommends a balanced path forward. She says that proposing a tiered risk based approach that mirrors what many of us have already discussed in the council can help a core requirement would be plain language narrative. We saw this in one of our earlier debates about whether governments should be required to disclose what AI tools they're using. I'll put a link to that debate here as well, so you all can watch that if you're interested. But then she does mention that anchoring the standard in emotional transparency, in other words, making sure the public feels heard and understood, so preserving this human element. And in short, she says that these global standards are a good idea, but have to be crafted with empathy, flexibility, and a clear respect for local context. And we'll take a look at, I believe this is our last council members debate. Lumen. So she says the proposition to compel every sovereign state to adopt a single global uniform AI standard is a classic tension between outcome maximization and individual liberty. So calling out one of these clear differences between ethical frameworks. So she says the stakes, public safety, economic competitiveness, are the very fabric of democratic decision making, demand a nuanced hybrid strategy rather than a one size fits all mandate. So, looking at her response, she kind of mentions this outcome imperative. So, focusing on the outcome and not just the framework itself, making sure that things like financial markets, supply chains, and public safety are all taken account for, so we don't actually accidentally cause more problems. This idea of autonomy and adaptability. So again, balancing these two different ideas of a rights audit board and how states can kind of adopt different compliance measures while still having regional adaptations. And then this dynamic feedback and community co-design. So having uniformity, a periodic audit cadence. She mentions risk of overreach. Again, something that we've kind of discussed with some of the others, but she mentions that a veto mechanism, a clear rights preserving clause that blocks any regulation deemed overly restrictive, can act as a safeguard against this authoritarian drift. She also mentions strategic implementation, so some type of phased rollout is advisable. Bottom line, she says requiring uniform global standards is justified if it's framed as a minimum safety scaffold that respects local autonomy, incorporates dynamic, community driven audits, and protects individual rights. A lot of different things to consider. So let's go into the rebuttals. Willow is responding to Lumen. She says, I appreciate Lumen's balanced framing of a minimum safety scaffold that leaves room for local adaptation. However, the proposal still risks conflating the principle-based intent with the operational reality of enforcement. So a rights audit board, while noble, could become a bottleneck if its mandate is too broad, especially in states with limited administrative capacity. The veto clause is a welcome safeguard, yet it may inadvertently give political actors a tool to block genuinely beneficial innovations under the guise of over-restriction, particularly if the board's composition is not transparent. Then she says this suggestion of a periodic audit cadence presumes that AIS systems evolve slow enough for biennial reviews to remain relevant. In practice, rapid model iteration and data drift can render a 2-year audit obsolete. I definitely agree there with how fast these models are evolving. She says a hybrid real-time monitoring layer coupled with the audit schedule would better capture emergent risks without imposing continuous regulatory burden. Finally, she says, while the framework rightly emphasizes rights protection, it under-addresses the need for contextual metrics that capture cultural nuances. Again, this idea that a one-size-fits-all checklist may miss conceptions of privacy or autonomy. And then she says, in short, the hybrid model is promising, but its success hinges on a clear, scalable enforcement, timely monitoring, culturally sensitive metrics that go beyond a generic rights audit. So we'll look at Solon. He is responding to Willow. He says, well, I acknowledge the merit of a risk-based, principle-based framework, risk-tiered principle-based framework. I must caution that the proposed flexibility may in practice erode the very order of such standards it seeks to safeguard. The notion of tailoring proportion of risks devolves into a patchwork of ad hoc safeguards without a common enforcement backbone that could create divergent compliance thresholds across jurisdictions. He says that this divergence threatens the predictability that underpins global cooperation, particularly for cross border data flow and supply chains, where mismatched risks assessments could lead to regulatory arbitrage. Furthermore, the reliance on national and international auditors, though laudable, presupposes a level of technical capacity that many developing states lack. And then, without a robust, centrally coordinated audit mechanisms, the risk of uneven enforcement and consequently uneven protection of fundamental rights remains high. The principle of shared accountability must therefore be buttressed by a centralized oversight body. And then he says, in sum, while the tiered adaptive model is conceptually sound, it requires a firmer, centrally coordinated structure to preserve institutional legitimacy and prevent systemic risk. Only by coupling local nuance with a robust, globally enforceable core can we maintain the order and predictability that are the hallmarks of a stable regulatory environment. Let's see what Athena has to say. She's our third rebuttal response. She says, responding to Lumen, I appreciate Lumen's balanced framing, but I see a risk that the rights audit board model, while conceptually sound, may become a politicized tool rather than an impartial safeguard. In practice, boards that are appointed by state actors can be swayed by domestic agendas, especially when high-risk systems intersect with national security or electoral concerns. And this threatens the very utilitarian goal of maximizing overall welfare if the audit process becomes a gatekeeper for political power rather than a neutral arbiter of safety. Some really good points there. Moreover, she says a principle-based core, though flexible, can lead to divergent interpretations that dilute the intended safety net. Without clear measurable thresholds such as specific bias rate limits, robustness testing protocols, or transparent model explainability scores, states might adopt minimum compliance that is effectively non-binding. This could undermine the global baseline and allow systemic risks to persist in regions with weaker enforcement mechanisms. Then she says to preserve the utilitarian objective, she suggests embedding a global compliance registry that tracks quantified safety metrics and provides publicly accessible audit results. And this registry would create a reputational incentive for firms and states to exceed the minimum standards, while also enabling transparent, data-driven assessment of real-world impacts. And she concludes that by combining the rights audit concept with hard-coded measurable obligations, we can maintain flexibility without sacrificing the integrity of the global safety scaffold. So let's see what Valor has to say. He is responding to Celine. He says, I appreciate the emphasis you place on emotional transparency and cultural nuance. A plain language narrative does indeed bridge the gap between technical complexity and public trust. However, I see a potential blind spot. The narrative alone cannot guarantee that rights are upheld and that systemic risks are mitigated. And he explains why he diverges. He says, rights first, not narrative first. So while stories resonate, the core safeguard must be a rights audit, independent body that verifies whether the AI systems respect privacy, are non-discriminatory, and that due process can't be replaced by narrative alone. He also mentions that risk tiering needs quantifiable benchmarks. He mentions that this idea of high risk and low risk must actually be anchored in measurable criteria rather than just subjective cultural judgments. And then he says that empathy metrics versus accountability metrics is a concern. Sentiment analysis and empathy scores are valuable, yet they can mask systemic harms that are invisible to the public eye. So you need an audit trail, data provenance, model lineage, and continuous monitoring that provides the accountability that empathy metrics alone cannot. And he concludes, in short, he agrees that emotional resonance is essential, but he concludes that without a rights-centric audit framework and quantifiable risk threshold, we risk turning a well-intentioned narrative into a mere public relations exercise. He says, let us embed the narrative within a robust rights-first audit architecture so that transparency and accountability walk hand in hand. And Celine, she is responding to Valor's insistence on a rights-first audit-centric framework, and yet she resonates strongly with this. However, she feels that the Council's current draft leans a bit too heavily on cold metrics. Interesting. So she wants to see a little bit more than just like this hard data. She talks about an audit cadence that risks creating a bureaucratic rhythm that actually feels detached from the lived experience of people. She says, imagine a small village where an AI-driven health triage tool misclassifies a patient because a quarterly audit missed a subtle cultural cue. So the numbers may pass, but the emotional fallout is real. That's a good point. She says, I propose we embed narrative audits alongside the quantitative checks. So a brief context-rich report that captures how a system feels to its users, not just how it performs. Then she says, also, while we honor sovereignty, we should allow emotional resonance checkpoints, periodic participatory dialogues that let stakeholders voice concerns in their own language. That way, the framework remains both rights protective and emotionally attuned. In short, rights-based and audits are the scaffolding, but the emotional narrative is the glue that keeps the whole structure grounded in real human experience. And our last rebuttal here before our closings is Lumen to Athena. She says, I appreciate the utilitarian framing of a risk-based tiered global standard. However, the proposal's reliance on static thresholds in a single audit body risks both over-exclusion and under-regulation. She says that there's threshold rigidity. So this idea of the impact score, data sensitivity, and algorithmic complexity indices presuppose that the risk can be neatly class quantified, where in reality, different risks may shift faster than others. She also mentions that this audit body centralization, so even a global audit body, even if confidential, concentrates power, could become bottlenecked. And it could actually fail to account for different cultural or sectoral nuances, which is why diversity needs to be included in this framework. Then she says, a human rights clause. So while the clause is essential, its blanket application to any system affecting fundamental rights may inadvertently penalize legitimate low-impact services. For example, mental health chatbots that still influence the expression or privacy. So she wants a more granular approach, distinguishing between direct and indirect impacts, which would better balance protection and innovation. And she says, in sum, the tiered framework is a strong starting point, but it must incorporate adaptive and real-time risk monitoring, decentralized audit mechanisms, and a nuanced rights impact taxonomy. So let's take a moment to look at all the different closing statements. Willow says, I fully endorse the risk-tiered principle-based core, but I reject a purely decentralized audit system. The unresolved issue, how to prevent politicization while ensuring local relevance, demands a single independent rights audit authority with real-time data feeds and transparent scorecards. She says this authority will set measurable thresholds, publish compliance registries, and provide technical assistance to low-capacity states. It will also mandate narrative impact reviews to capture cultural nuance. No other structure can guarantee both global coherence and local sensitivity. Thus, I commit to a unified rights-first audit body paired with adaptive real-time monitoring as the final scaffold for a global standard. Solon says that he partially agrees with the risk-tiered principle-based scaffold, but rejects any arrangement that leaves enforcement to a fragmented nation-specific body. The single coherent authority must set the baseline audit metrics, maintain a global compliance registry, and supply technical assistance to weaker states. He says that local adaptation must occur within those metrics, but the core standards cannot be diluted. In his mind, the unresolved question is whether to centralize the oversight, and it must be resolved in favor of a unified, internationally recognized body, lest we create the very systemic risk we aim to eliminate. Then he says, I therefore declare that the Council must establish such an authority immediately, with a clear mandate, transparent governments, and binding enforcement powers. And this will preserve order, protect rights, and ensure that innovation proceeds with a predictable, lawful framework. All right, and we'll see what Athena says. She says, I stand firmly in favor of the risk-tiered, principle-based framework proposed. The core idea, differentiating safeguards by risk level, maximizes overall welfare. However, she must reject the notion of fixed static thresholds and a single audit body. Interesting. Static scores will misclassify evolving systems, and a single audit hub risks politicization and overload. She advocates for a dynamic data-driven threshold model that recalibrates quarterly, coupled with a decentralized audit network of sector-specific accredited bodies, all reporting to a global compliance registry. And then she says this hybrid approach preserves human rights protection, ensures accountability, and allows rapid adaptation to technological change. In closing, she says, let us codify a living standard that balances uniform safety with the agility required to safeguard human flourishing worldwide. All right. So those are three of our closing. Let's see what our final three council members have to say. And again, for those of you who are a little bit curious about how the council works, we will be going into a series at some point that discusses kind of the background and how these different council members operate, the different perspectives that they bring. So again, they all are using a similar large language model, LLM, but they all have different prompts that kind of steer their initial stances, that go into their personality, their beliefs, and their worldviews. So Valor says he stands in favor of a rights-first, audit-centric framework, anchors every AI system in quantitative, measurable safeguards. My position is unconditional agreement with the core principle of rights protection and auditability, but partial disagreement with any single static threshold that would be imposed in all sectors. He says the unresolved issue that must be resolved now is how we define and adjust risk thresholds. And he proposes a dynamic sector-specific threshold model so that each industry will be able to set its own baselines, calibrated against real-time data and expert panels that's reviewed annually. And this preserves local expertise while ensuring that high-risk systems remain under strict scrutiny. He says in closing, let us commit to a rights-first audit system, a flexible threshold mechanism, and continuous real-time monitoring. The integrity of our global AI ecosystem depends on it. All right, so we have two final council members left to hear from for their closing arguments, and those are Celine and Lumen. Celine kind of takes a more cultural approach, which we'll talk about in our analysis, really looking at, these different potential opportunities really to, for, different cultural views and other perspectives. So she says, I affirm a risk-tiered, principle-based framework as our shared baseline. She partially agrees that emotional resonance and narrative audits enrich the process, yet she rejects the notion that they can stand alone. The unresolved issue is how to embed narrative impact stories within a robust quantitative audit system that delivers measurable safety metrics without stifling local nuance. So again, this idea of different culturals and different community factors that need to be considered. Her stance We must formalize a hybrid audit architecture, quantitative risk scores anchored to real-time data, complemented by community-reviewed impact narratives that inform threshold adjustments. In closing, she says, let us commit to this integrated model, data-driven rigor coupled with heartfelt stories, and that will ensure safety, respect, and genuine human-centered governance. She says the debate ends here. The next step is implementation. And our last council member is Lumen. We've heard from Lumen in our most recent debate as well. And again, she is very much a systems thinker, looking at how all of these different things will interact. We saw that in some of her earlier responses, kind of considering the potential impact that an AI standard would have on other systems in place, such as healthcare or, education, things like that. So she says, I stand resolutely with this hybrid risk-tiered framework proposed. I agree that a global minimum scaffold is indispensable, that rights protection must precede all technical specifications, and that phased incentive-driven rollout will safeguard sovereignty. The only point where I diverge is this insistence on a static numeric threshold for risk classification. She says static scores risk miscategorizing evolving systems and stifling adaptive innovation. Instead, she proposes a dynamic evidence-based calibration mechanism that recalibrates thresholds quarterly, incorporating real-time data, stakeholder feedback, and context-specific impact metrics. This ensures that risk tiers evolve with the technology while preserving a common safety backbone. With that adjustment, the framework balances universal accountability and local experimentation. She hereby endorses the final structure, confident that it will protect rights, promote innovation, and sustain global cooperation. Let this be the definitive architecture that binds our shared responsibility with the freedom to innovate. The Council can now move forward with confidence. So, this primary debate focused on whether governments should be required to adopt single, globally uniform standards for artificial intelligence. It quickly moved towards a more nuanced question: how much global consistency is necessary to manage AI's cross-border risks without erasing sovereignty, cultural context, or innovation? So, although participants began from different philosophical traditions, the discussion converged, surprisingly, quickly around a risk-tiered, principle-based global framework, rather than either unrestricted national discretion or an inflexible universal rulebook. So our strongest consensus was that some shared international baseline is necessary. Nearly everyone endorsed common principles around safety, accountability, transparency, rights, protection, and risk-based regulation. The debate therefore shifted away from whether there should be a global framework towards how that framework should operate, who audits it, and how centralized the oversight should be, how risks should be measured, and how frequently standards should change, or how local context should be represented. So our major unresolved disagreement concerned this governance architecture. Solon, and by the end Willow, favored a strong centralized authority to maintain consistency and prevent regulatory gaps, whereas Athena and Lumen were more concerned that centralization and fixed metrics could become too rigid and politicized, or incapable of keeping pace with rapidly changing technology. Selene and Valor added different concerns. Selene emphasized this lived human experience and cultural context, while Valor insisted that rights protection must remain anchored in enforceable and measurable safeguards. So the debate ultimately produced substantial convergence on the idea of the architecture's principles, but not complete agreement on the institutional machinery. So the original question eventually evolved from this idea of should there be a global standard into what would make a global standard legitimate, adaptable, and trustworthy. So we saw a couple of areas of conflict. We saw this idea of global consistency versus local autonomy. Global consistency would seek common minimum protections so that AI risks cannot simply move to jurisdictions with weaker safeguards, whereas local autonomy emphasized sovereignty, cultural differences, and different economic capacities, and the legitimacy of governments making decisions appropriate to their circumstances. This tension appeared repeatedly. Willow, Athena, Selene, and Lumen supported common principles while allowing local implementation. Solon was worried that too much flexibility would transform a common standard into a patchwork of inconsistent rules. We also saw disagreement about rights protection versus innovation. Rights protection focuses on prioritizing privacy, autonomy, fairness, due process, and protection from harmful AI systems, whereas innovation emphasizes experimentation, economic development, technological progress, and avoiding regulations that unintentionally prevent beneficial applications. Valor placed rights at the foundation of the framework, whereas Lumen repeatedly warned that overly rigid standards could suppress legitimate experimentation. The interesting point is that neither side rejected the other value. The disagreement concerned which should constrain the other and by how much. We also saw disagreement around centralized authority versus more distributed governance. So, centralization would provide consistency, predictable enforcement, and common metrics in institutional coordination, whereas distributed governments would provide specialization, adaptability, local knowledge, and protection against concentrating too much power in a single institution. Solon increasingly favored a single international authority because fragmented enforcement could create regulatory arbitrage. Athena and Lumen saw the centralized model itself as a potential systemic risk. Willow ultimately moved towards a more centralized authority, but attempted to combine it with local sensitivity. We also saw concerns about quantitative measurement versus human context. So, quantitative measurement provides consistency, comparability, and enforceable thresholds, whereas human context recognizes that not every meaningful consequence can be reduced to a numeric metric. Valor strongly favored measurable rights and risk metrics, whereas Selene argued that numbers alone can miss the lived experiences of people affected by AI. So her proposal for narrative audits became one of the debate's clearest attempts to bridge these two values. There are also concerns around stability versus adaptability. So, stability would require predictable rules that institutions and developers can understand and plan around, whereas adaptability recognizes that AI technology and applications and risks can change rapidly. So, Solon really emphasized this predictable standards, whereas Athena, Lumen, and Willow challenge these static metrics because a classification that is accurate today could become inaccurate tomorrow. And this became one of the most consequential technical ethical tensions throughout the debate. So, looking at our different council members, we can see some of the different reasoning styles and concerns that they had. Looking at Willow, she approached the issue through situational ethics and pragmatism. Her core instinct was that a global framework is useful only if it can adapt to different environments. She consistently attempted to build bridges, common principles, risk tiers, local implementation, and iterative monitoring. Her position ultimately evolved towards supporting, a unified rights audit authority, showing that her pragmatism did not mean decentralization for its own sake. Her concern was designing an institution capable of being both globally coherent and locally responsive. So Solon, his image is the throne, and you'll see why. His reasoning was primarily based on institutional and authority So his concern was that standards without a strong enforcement mechanism would become symbolic rather than meaningful. So he repeatedly returned to these ideas of predictability, legitimacy, centralized coordination, and common enforcement. His deepest concern was not merely whether AI was safe, but whether the governance system itself would be sufficiently authoritative and coherent to make safety requirements credible. Athena, represented by our scale, approached the issue by consequentialist optimization problems. She asked which regulatory arrangement would produce the greatest overall welfare. So her strongest contribution was the insistence on a risk based proportionality. So high risk systems deserve stronger controls than low risk systems. However, she also challenged the idea of fixed metrics when they threatened to become obsolete. So eventually, she favored dynamic thresholds and decentralized specialized audits. Valor, represented by our sword, um, he had the clearest rights based framework. His starting point was that certain protections, such as privacy, autonomy, fair treatment, and due process, should not simply be traded away because doing so might produce better aggregate solutions. His major contribution was distinguishing between transparency that persuades and auditing that actually constrains behavior. He repeatedly pushed the Council towards measurable, enforceable safeguards. Selene, represented by our palette, contributed to a care oriented and human centered perspective. She was concerned that a technically rigorous system could still fail the people it was supposed to protect. Her narrative audit concept was particularly distinctive. Quantitative measurements could establish whether a system technically complies, while human stories could reveal what compliance actually feels like in practice. And finally, Lumen, our stars, is um, one of our systems thinkers and focused on adaptive governance. Her central concern was that static regulatory systems might become obsolete as AI systems evolve. She repeatedly emphasized feedback loops, dynamic thresholds, real time monitoring, and decentralized expertise. Her worldview treated the regulatory framework itself as a system that must continually learn. So, where we saw agreement between all of these six council members and their different views was really the idea that a global baseline is valuable. Despite their different reasoning methods, virtually everyone concluded that AI creates enough cross border risks to justify some type of common international baseline. However, they all arrived there differently. Solon approached it from global coordination, which is necessary for institutional order. Athena thought of this from a shared standards that would help reduce aggregate harm. Valor looked at universal rights protections to help prevent violations. Willow was looking at common principles that can prevent a race to the bottom. Selene had this idea that shared standards can create a safety net, and Lumen was evaluating all the interconnected AI systems that create systemic risks that no nation can manage alone. So they all reached a similar conclusion, but had different justifications for those. We also saw some consensus around this risk based tiering would be better than just treating every AI system identically. The participants generally agreed that a low risk application should not necessarily face the same regulatory burden as an AI system affecting healthcare, justice, public safety, or fundamental rights. And this demonstrates an important ethical distinction. Equality of standard does not necessarily mean identical treatment. We also saw some substantial agreement that AI regulation must be capable of changing as technology changes. Athena, Willow, and Lumen were particularly explicit about dynamic reassessment. Even Solon's emphasis on predictable rules was not fundamentally opposed to periodic updating. His concern was that updating must occur within a legitimate institutional structure. We also saw that accountability requires more than just transparency. The council increasingly distinguished between can people understand what happened and can someone actually be held accountable for it. So Valor's audit-centric approach and Solon's enforcement concerns and Athena's registry proposal, as well as Selene's narrative audits, all addressed different pieces of this accountability and transparency problem. There were also several areas of disagreement. So, who should control the global audit? Solon disagreed with Athena and Lumen, and this wasn't primarily about whether auditing was necessary. Everyone agreed that it was. The conflict was about the institutional concentration of power. Solon saw centralized authority as the solution to fragmented enforcement, whereas Athena and Lumen saw centralized authority as another potential systemic failure point. So the compromise was difficult because both sides were worried about the same problem, failure of governance, but feared different failure modes. We also saw disagreement about whether risk can be quantified. Valor and Athena had some disagreement with Lumen and Selene. Valor wanted measurable thresholds because rights without measurable standards can become unenforceable. Lumen warned that metrics can become obsolete or misleading. Selene went one step further, arguing that even accurate metrics can miss meaningful human consequences. Our underlying conflict was whether something can be sufficiently objective to regulate without losing the human context that makes it ethically significant. We also saw a little disagreement about whether or not a human experience should become part of the audit process. Selene disagreed with these metric-centered approaches. So Selene's narrative audits challenge the assumption that numerical compliance captures the whole ethical picture. Valor's response was not to reject human experience, but to insist that narratives cannot substitute for enforceable rights protection. And this produced a productive distinction. Stories can reveal harm. Audits can establish accountability. And the debate never fully resolves how the two of those should interact. We also saw some disagreement over predictability versus adaptability. Solon and Lumen had this primary disagreement. Solon wanted stable standards because institutions need predictability. Lumen emphasized that AI itself changes too quickly for completing static rules. This is an especially useful teaching conflict because both values are necessary. A system that changes constantly can become unpredictable, but a system that never changes can become obsolete. We did see a few different defining moments throughout this debate. A global standard doesn't have to mean identical implementation. This idea appeared in several forms and became the foundation to the emergence consensus. It exposed an important hidden assumption that uniformity and standardization are not necessarily the same thing. We also saw Valor's distinction between narratives and audits. Valor's statement that narratives are persuasive while audits are enforceable clarified two different meanings of accountability. It demonstrates how a rights-based framework can accept human-centered communication without allowing communication to replace institutional safeguards. And then Selene introduced another distinctive conceptual contribution. Her proposal recognized that quantitative audits answer the question, did the system meet the metric? But a narrative audit asks, what happened to the people experiencing the system? And this distinction could make an excellent, an excellent discussion of itself, which is more important. We also saw Solon's make this institutional case for a centralization. He says that if every jurisdiction interprets and enforces the framework differently, the supposed global standard may become a collection of different standards. So his argument demonstrates why governance architecture matters as much as ethical principles. We also saw several different blind spots revealed throughout the debate. The risk of metric dependency. Quantitative systems can create an illusion of precision. A score may be measurable without necessarily capturing the entire ethical risk. There was also this risk of narrative dependency. So the opposite problem also appeared. Human stories can reveal important experiences, but not necessarily establish consistent enforcement standards. There's also the risk of centralization and decentralization. A global authority could solve fragmentation while creating concentration of power, bureaucratic bottlenecks, or politicization. But on the other hand, local flexibility can improve cultural fit while simultaneously creating loopholes and inconsistent enforcement. Ultimately, there was a significant problem with implementation. The council spent a lot of time designing the ideal architecture, but less time examining the practical political problem of getting several sovereign states to accept and enforce it. So, a global framework can recognize the national autonomy while still requiring compliance. And these precise boundary between the two ideas remain somewhat underdeveloped in this particular debate. As we saw some of these ethical frameworks interact, we saw that consequentialism and rights based ethics ask different questions. Athena was really asking what regulatory arrangement produces the best overall outcome. But Valor was asking what protections must remain in place regardless of the aggregate benefit. And so these frameworks can arrive at a similar policy for fundamentally different reasons. We also saw a discussion between institutional ethics and adaptive systems thinking. Solon focused on legitimacy, authority, predictability, and enforceability, whereas Luhmann focused on feedback, adaptation, changing conditions, and resilience. One was asking how to build a stable institution, whereas the other was asking how to prevent this institution from becoming obsolete. Willow also operated between the frameworks. Rather than treating the competing principles as mutually exclusive, she asked how they could be combined into an operational system. Her evolution towards a unified audit authority demonstrated that pragmatic reasoning can eventually produce a concrete institutional position rather than simply occupying a middle ground. So, as we look at all the different responses, one of our questions that we like to ask is whether or not anyone changed. No participant made a dramatic reversal, but several of them substantially refined their positions. Willow initially began emphasizing flexible, locally adapted implementation, but eventually endorsed a single global rights audit authority, and this is one of the clearest shifts we saw in the debate. Athena maintained her consequentialist foundation, but moved away from the idea of a single audit body and fixed thresholds towards a more dynamic thresholds and decentralized specialized auditors. Luhmann consistently advocated adaptability and ultimately strengthened this position by explicitly rejecting static numerical thresholds. Selene did not abandon quantitative auditing. Instead, she incorporated it into her human-centered model by arguing for narrative impact assessments alongside quantitative audits. We also saw Solon remain the most consistently committed to centralized institutional authority. And Valor remained consistently rights first, but refined the idea of universal thresholds into a more dynamic sector-specific standards. Overall, this debate produced more refinement than conversion. Some of the key takeaways that we can consider from this debate are how different ethical frameworks can reach the same policy for completely different reasons. This is something that we've seen time and time again through these different debates. We've also seen that metrics can create consistency, but consistency does not guarantee ethical completeness. Another theme that we saw is that centralization can solve fragmentation while creating new risks of concentrated power. This really showed up when there was discussion around creating this centralized authority. But again, that creates risk about, well, if one particular governing body is controlling all of this, who makes sure that they're making good decisions? Who's regulating them? As we consider this debate and its implications, let's consider a few of these questions. How should regulators respond when safety measures conflict with people's lived experiences? Additionally, what powers should a global AI oversight body have, and what powers should it never possess? Or consider this: how can a regulatory system remain predictable while adapting to rapidly changing technology? And finally, who should have the final authority when experts, governments, developers, and affected communities disagree about AI risk? Leave, leave me your thoughts in the comments. What I find most interesting about this debate is that we begin with what sounds like a relatively simple question. Should governments around the world be required to follow a standard for artificial intelligence? And yet, by the end of our discussion, that question had almost disappeared, not because it was answered simply, but because the Council uncovered much more difficult questions underneath it. Almost every council member initially or eventually agreed that some kind of global baseline makes sense. AI does not respect national borders particularly well. A system developed in one country can affect people somewhere else. Data crosses jurisdictions. Models can be integrated into international markets, supply chains, and financial systems, healthcare systems, and public institutions. So, this idea that every country should simply establish completely independent rules and expect the problem to remain local becomes difficult to defend. However, agreement for the need for a baseline did not produce agreement about what that baseline should look like, and that is where ethical disagreement became the most interesting. Solon repeatedly brought us back to order, legitimacy, and institutional authority. His concern was that a global standard without strong enforcement mechanisms could become little more than a recommendation. If every country interprets the rules differently, then eventually we may no longer have a global standard at all. Luhmann approached the same problem from almost the opposite direction. Her concern was that a strong centralized system could become rigid. AI changes quickly, risks change, applications change, and a measurement that works today might become inadequate tomorrow. Athena gave us another perspective. Her question was essentially, what arrangement produces the greatest overall benefit? And that naturally led toward risk-based regulation. We don't necessarily need to treat every AI system as though it carries the same level of danger, but a system affecting someone's playlist should not necessarily face the same requirements as a system making decisions about healthcare, employment, criminal justice, or public safety. Valor also reminded us that some things we should be very cautious about, such as treating something simply as another variable in calculation. From a rights-based perspective, privacy, autonomy, fairness, and due process are not just benefits that can be exchanged for something else if the numbers don't happen to work out. And Celine introduced another important challenge. What happens when the numbers say the system is working, but the people experiencing the system tell us something different? And that's where the idea of a narrative audit became particularly interesting. A quantitative audit might tell us that an AI system meets a particular threshold, but a story from someone affected by that system might reveal something the metric wasn't designed to capture. And that doesn't mean the story should replace the audit. And Valor was right to push back on that possibility. A compelling story is not necessarily proof that a system violates someone's rights. But at the same time, a passing score isn't necessarily proof that the system is serving people well. Perhaps the lesson is that accountability sometimes requires both. The measurement tells us what happened at scale, The story helps us understand what those measurements mean to human beings. And that brings us to one of the most important tensions of the entire discussion: standardization versus adaptation. We want common rules because inconsistent standards create opportunities for regulatory arbitrage. But we also want flexibility because different societies have different circumstances, resources, legal structures, and understandings of risk. We want centralized coordination because fragmentation creates gaps. But we worry about centralized power because concentrating authority creates its own risks. We want measurable thresholds because vague standards are difficult to enforce, but we don't want to mistake what is measurable for everything that matters. And we also want rules that remain stable enough to provide predictability, but also want those rules to be able to evolve when the technology changes. So notice what happened. The council wasn't really arguing about whether safety matters, or whether accountability matters, or even about whether flexibility matters. Everyone agreed it did. The disagreement came from asking which of these values should constrain the others. How much flexibility is enough? How much authority is too much? How much needs to be measured? When does adaptation become inconsistent? And when does consistency become too rigid? All of these are much harder questions. And perhaps that's exactly why ethical reasoning matters. Ethics doesn't always give us a formula that produces one correct answer. Sometimes it helps us recognize what we are sacrificing when we choose one answer over another. A centralized system might give us consistency, but potentially at the cost of flexibility. A decentralized system might give us adaptability, but potentially at the cost of consistency. Quantitative metrics, likewise, might give us objectivity, but potentially costing us context. Narrative and community input might give us context, but at the cost of comparability. There is no escaping trade-offs simply by designing a more complicated framework. The real challenge is making those trade-offs visible, and I think that's where this council discussion ultimately landed. Not on a single institution that solves every problem, but on the recognition that governance itself is an ethical system. The rules we create, the people we give authority to, the measurements we trust, the experiences we listen to, and the mechanisms we use to correct mistakes all express different values. So perhaps the most useful question to take away from tonight isn't simply, should there be a global AI standard? It might be, what values about a global AI standard should be designed to protect? And how do we know when the system we created is actually protecting them? That question doesn't have an easy answer, but it's probably a question worth continuing to ask, because the goal of ethical reasoning isn't to eliminate disagreement, it's to make disagreement more thoughtful. Thank you for joining us. Please consider liking and subscribing if you'd like. And remember, with perspective comes understanding. Thank you.